All right, everybody, let's find our places. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a set of conversations about the American Revolution and the Constitution. This gathering is part of a large and ambitious project for us here at AEI, and I want to say just a few words about that larger project before we get started. 2026, as all of you know, will mark the 250th anniversary of the American founding. And a lot of organizations in a variety of ways are going to try to mark that milestone birthday. But in thinking through what kind of distinct contribution we might be able to make here in particular, we concluded that we should produce something of a lasting intellectual product through a set of conferences that then will yield a set of books and educational materials beyond that explore how Americans now should understand some of the key themes and questions at issue in our country's founding. Those materials can outlast the anniversary. They can serve educators and students and citizens for many years to come. And to do that, they'll draw on scholars from a variety of fields with a diversity of viewpoints to offer Americans some wisdom about our civic and political inheritance. And so over the course of more than 2 years, we're hosting 8 scholarly conferences here at AEI, each of which is devoted to a particular facet of the character and legacy of the American Revolution. We've had 6 of these. The first considered democracy and the Revolution. The second looked at some of the economic facets of the American founding. The third looked at religion and the founding. The fourth was on natural rights and the common good and the Revolution. The fifth on slavery and equality in the American founding. And the sixth looked at the Revolution from an international perspective. Today's is the 7th of these gatherings, focused, as I say, on the Revolution and the American Constitution. Each of these will result in a book of essays on its theme, as well as various other kinds of video and audio and digital media products. The first 3 of those books are now out. We've got copies here, and please help yourself. All of these essays will also be online over time. And all 8 of these books will be gathered into a collection to be published in time for the July 4th, 2026 anniversary, to be widely distributed as an educational and civic resource. We're going to make them available to libraries, to colleges, to high school teachers, and beyond. Our goal is really, in a sense, to create a 21st century literature on the founding and to help to inform and reinforce the growing movement to strengthen civic education and civic learning in America. In today's gathering, as in every one of these 8 conferences, we're taking up a subject that demands careful thought and that will benefit from the attention of scholars from different disciplines with different views. Today's subject is really, in a sense, about the conclusion of the revolutionary era, the new regime that emerged from the break with the old. The Constitution was, in some respects, the culminating achievement of the revolutionary period, but its relationship to the American Revolution, as we'll see, is not a simple matter. It was, in one sense, an application of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, translated into political practice, but it was also, in another sense, a product of hard-earned lessons in the years that followed the Revolution. Lessons about the necessity of effective government, the dangers of mob rule, and all kinds of political questions that Americans had to wrestle with as an independent nation. Could the people who broke with Britain also be the people who founded a successful modern republic? And how are those 2 acts related? We're going to think about this complicated and important set of questions with the help of some great scholars today, really an incredible all-star cast. We're going to do that in 2 panels. The first with Adam White and Harvey Mansfield will be moderated by my AEI colleague, Gary Schmidt. The second with Akhil Amar, Jack Rakove, and Colleen Sheehan, moderated by my colleague, Joel Alisea. The moderators will properly introduce our speakers to you. And so with that, let me just turn it over to Gary Schmidt, and we can begin. Gary, please.
Good afternoon, and welcome to those of you here, those watching online, and those watching on C-SPAN. As you've all said, I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a senior fellow here in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program at AEI, and I'll be moderating this first panel. The panel's topic is Constituting a Republic, and as you've all said, our panel speakers are Harvard professor Harvey C. Mansfield and AEI's Adam White. The format is really straightforward. We'll hear from both of them for 15 to 20 minutes, whatever they want to take. And then we'll have a discussion among the three of us following that. And then following that, we'll take questions from our audience. So let me now more formally introduce both speakers. Harvey Mansfield is currently a research professor at Harvard University, an institution he has been a part of as a member of the faculty since 1962, including a stint as chair of the Department of Government in the mid-70s. At the time of his retirement from teaching, he was the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Government. Professor Mansfield is the author, translator, and editor of over a dozen landmark volumes that have deepened our understanding of the origins of modern political parties, representative government, the executive, modern political philosophy, and American constitutionalism. He has translated 3 books of Machiavelli's, and with his late wife, Delba Winthrop, translated Tocqueville's Democracy in America with a fabulous introduction. In 2004, he received a National Humanities Medal from President Bush. Now, given how long he had been at Harvard and the scores of faculty and department meetings he had dutifully attended, I thought that the president at that time might well have given him a Purple Heart as well. Adam White, my colleague in AEI's Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program, is the Lawrence H. Silberman Chair in Constitutional Governance here at AEI. And he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the Supreme Court and the administrative state. He also directs the Scalia Law School's C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. At Harvard Law School graduate, Adam has served as a clerk on the DC Court of Appeals and on various boards of the American Bar Association, and currently serves on the Administrative Conference of the United States. And for his past sins, he was in 2021 a commissioner on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court, otherwise known as the Commission for Court Packing. Adam has written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Affairs Commentary, Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and Notre Dame Law Review, among many other publications. And he is currently working on a book on the current state of the American constitutional order and the question of separation of powers. Harvey, over to you.
Thank you, Gary. Aristotle. Most of my talk is going to be on Aristotle. A little bit will be on the actual subject of the meaning. But my thesis is that the American Revolution is part of the modern revolution against the authority of Aristotle. Il maestro di coloro che sanno. The master of those who know. Who said that? Dante. At the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, the language of politics and political science reveals some hesitation to call it a change of government, as does the Declaration of Independence. The phrase change of regime, implying something more fundamental, has come into fashion. Or better to say, since regime translates a Greek word used in classical political science, returned to favor. In that political science, regime means a kind of rule, whereas modern liberal political science makes a distinction between government and society that limits government with the aim of preventing rule that combines government and society. The renewed sense of regime is aimed directly at liberalism and the liberal understanding of the American Revolution. Which view is correct? The brief framing I just gave needs to be elaborated because the classical regime, long abandoned, is not well understood today, and liberal limited government, once intended as an alternative and replacement for the regime, has lost its original clarity as a distinction. Which is big government, for example? Is it still properly limited or a regime? Regime is at the heart of classical political science and shown to be the heart of politics by its two grand masters. The Greek word politeia appears as republic in Plato's Republic and as regime or constitution in Book 3, the most important part of Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle says that a human being is by nature a political animal, not merely familial or social. A human being is also said to be a rational animal, one who gives reasons for his desires. These reasons are directed to other human beings to convince them to agree that they would have acted as the speaker acted. By giving a reason, one states the principle by which another would act. Merely stating one's desire is not enough. The speaker's principle should rule the situation. Ruling takes its origin in speech or rational justification. What I did should be the rule for you, too, whether you are superior, inferior, or equal. Reasoning leads to ruling, and the sociability of communication implied by human rationality leads to politics. A political animal is a ruler, even a person who says that he desires for himself, not for others. The regime is the rule of the whole of society by a part of which, because it rules, gives a characteristic stamp and style to that society. No society stays together without rule. It must be ruled by some part of itself. The part that rules does not represent the whole, as with modern representative government, but rather makes the other parts contribute to the rule, to its rule. This rule shows itself in the most open and public ways, each a kind of display of who is in charge. The ruling part is the most powerful part, always the most publicly visible. The Greek word for rule, arche, also means beginning or principle of rule. And arche is both a beginning in accordance with a principle and ruling according to a beginning. This beginning is never a beginning as if from a state of nature in which there is no rule, no regime. The state of nature with no government is invented by a modern political science, modern liberalism, is not possible for Aristotle, since man is a political animal by nature, not by contract or consent. Ruling is participating, taking part, taking one's part in a whole. The ruling part is partisan on behalf of its principle, as every regime moves in a certain direction in accordance with its principle. Every regime has a self-definition that is partisan and that shows itself in a partisan change. According to Aristotle, there are three kinds of revolution. He presents the first two as a contrast between an uprising, a stasis, a change in personnel, and a change of regime or constitution or form. The contrast shows that a regime does not depend on certain named individuals, but on a principle. Napoleon was an individual who made a revolution of regime we can call Napoleonic, because it applies to others besides himself. A third definition of revolution by Aristotle is the literal meaning of revolution in the cycle, a circle. Being partisan, regimes overlook or mismanage what they do not understand. In America, our principle is in the Declaration that all men are created equal. We try to manage obvious inequalities in honor, talent, and wealth by claiming that they benefit everybody, or at least those least advantaged. Sooner or later, though, the bias toward equality, its partial truth, will catch up our regime and bring it to an end. No regime is perfect. None rules in accordance with the truth of human nature. The likely result is a return to the beginning, so that we can make the same mistakes all over again. Or is it possible for a very wise individual, a philosopher, to found a permanent regime by avoiding the bias of regimes and finding a true whole that rather than a partisan one? Aristotle says that the most virtuous humans are the least likely to rebel. These are philosophers, and philosophers are few. To effect a revolution, they would have to find allies among the not-so-wise. And whether there are few or many. With undependable allies like these philosophers, we'll have to live with bias rather than remove it. Despite the profound doubts of the classical philosophers, the modern philosophers, we now call liberals, tried their best to find, and their followers to found, an impartial regime that would not be subject to partisan bias. For America, these philosophers were Locke and Montesquieu, who made the Constitution. The American founders, the founding followers, made their Constitution after Locke and Montesquieu. The American Revolution is part of the modern revolution made by modern philosophy, led by modern philosophers, and begun by Machiavelli. In his case and thereafter, the most virtuous are, contrary to Aristotle, the most likely to rebel. They envisage a permanent improvement in the status of humanity, a new regime that would actualize their philosophic thought. In this regime, yourself needs to be preserved in its rights, rather than your soul saved by obeying its alleged duties. And the purpose of government becomes, quote, to secure these rights. To do this, government must be limited to protecting individual rights, leaving the exercise of rights to individuals living freely in society. In this new function, government does not rule society. In Aristotelian terms, the regime does not form a certain way of life. The government represents society. Representative government, in this new sense, is the invention of liberalism. Government does not rule, but represents. It has a common good, one that benefits all individuals equally, the common benefit of Aristotle's political science based on the body, rather than the benefit in common that forms the soul. The gist of liberal political science is given in Locke's Letter on Toleration, where he says that the magistrate, the government, cares for bodies and not for souls. Liberalism is a formal doctrine. It does not tell you how to live. It tells you to pursue happiness, but does not define happiness. That's for you to define. Instead, liberalism tells you how to arrange to get what you want individually for yourself. Government is limited in its scope and it must respect the difference between what it can do and what society can contain. Government can hold elections, but not tell you how to vote. It can protect your right of free speech, but not tell you what to say. All right. We now have a picture of the basic structure of liberalism that centers on a distinction between government and society, a system of choice that accounts for necessities. It admits you can't have everything you wish, but insists that everything can be addressed and, in reduced sense, chosen responsibly. This structure leaves an empty center where Aristotle's regime places a principle of rule. Or one could say that liberalism has a principle of liberty in a form empty of content, to be filled not by the government but by civil society. Its life is in a formality and needs to be kept formal against the critics from the left and right, to be kept formal against them who want to take hold of that center. Liberals need to maintain free speech without defining free speech, and elections without saying who should be elected. The trouble with liberalism is that its empty center has a tendency to fill, arising from the very exercise of free speech that liberalism wants to respect. This fill-up comes from the way in which one choice leads to another, from the parties that develop under liberty, from the virtues necessary to liberty, from the religion that both sustains and endangers it, and from wars and other accidents. So this fill-up has several categories that I'll just mention right now. First is the parties in our country. They rule within liberalism. Our parties actually do tell you how to live. One of them tells you to be empathetic, to care. The other tells you to admire and look up. All human beings care and they look up to admire. But one of our parties emphasizes the first and the other the second. Second, virtues, which help to fill up the empty center. I mentioned two. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin promotes sincerity. What is his definition of sincerity? Use no hurtful deceit. Then there's Publius in the Federalist. Publius emphasizes a virtue, new virtues, responsibility, and energy. These are ways of exercising ambition, which is an old virtue. Maybe you didn't remember it, but ambition is one of Aristotle's 11 moral virtues. Then there's meritocracy. Meritocracy is the way democracy deals with human inequalities. We aren't all equal. We're unequal. But if we choose our unequals through their merit, and that alone, not by tradition or inheritance, that's second best to a democratic lottery, which truly makes men equal. And there's religion. Religion is easily seen or best seen in the rule of law. What keeps people in obedience to the law? Aristotle says it's the custom or belief that there is gods or God or some kind of divinity which is above us. So that religion has two functions. One is to lift us up because we live according to a principle, whereas beasts who are beneath us do not. And the other is to hold us down because we are not gods, even though or especially because we believe in God. Whereas the liberals treat religion, as we know, with a distinction between church and state. So, to say that liberalism survives requires that one apply the standard of success for a regime, for which one must resort to Aristotle's political science, or some other that equals or surpasses it. What is the content of the law that fills the empty center of liberalism? That is a question liberalism cannot answer on its own without violating its basic structure. The liberal constitution can pronounce only as to how we must decide. The correct process, not what we should decide. Machiavelli professed an effectual truth that reduced the formalities of morals and politics to their outcomes, the effects. This is the sort of thinking hostile to liberalism found in legal realism. In this view, the empty center is an arena for princes and other power seekers. But what do they want to do with their power? Aristotle brings up the good life, virtue, and the conditions of virtue. Liberalism is a regime of the anti-regime that must be judged according to the standard of the regime it opposes. Beginning as a denial of the good life, it must defend the goodness of the life it delivers instead of the good life. Thanks.
I just want to say before I begin, it's been an enormous joy to work with my colleagues the last year and a half on this series of books and essays. And now it's just an enormous honor to get to contribute an essay of my own alongside some of the greatest political philosophers and constitutional scholars of our time. I'll be speaking on republics and monarchs and mutability. And I'll just say one last thing. Professor Mansfield began with Aristotle and Dante, and I'll begin with last weekend. No kings, no kings. How reassuring it is that we still invoke the Founding Fathers, the revolution against monarchy, to justify today's political movements. Whether in the last weekend's No Kings protests or the Tea Party movement of a decade earlier, whether the present cause is right-minded or wrong-headed, despite all of our disagreements on every other issue under the sun, at least we Americans still agree on this: no kings. But what do we mean by this? What do we mean by no kings? When we share this timeless rallying cry, what exactly are we rallying around? We reject autocratic power, of course, and looking to the founders, we read the Declaration of Independence and find it replete with King George's abuses of power. A few examples. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He's abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. But curiously, those examples come late in the Declaration's indictment of King George. The founders' list of charges against the king begins not so much with abuses of power, but with absences of government, harmful vacuums of power caused by the king's willful neglect. Indeed, the Declaration's indictment of King George begins with these. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation, till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. The founders put these accusations first and foremost, but only to be overshadowed by the brutal abuses of power that make the Declaration's crescendo. And 250 years later, these initial accusations recede, even disappear, into the nation's collective memory. But they're well worth remembering, especially in our own time. The Declaration's passages on vacuums of power and unreliable, unenforced laws foreshadowed some of the most important parts of America's eventual constitutional debates. And unfortunately, they foreshadowed some of the greatest challenges of our own time. We start with the Declaration's words a little bit more. About those passages in the Declaration, if they seem opaque today, it bears mentioning that they also seemed opaque in 1776, at least to some of the Declaration's audiences. Pauline Maier put this point well in her landmark work, American Scripture. She writes, quote, "At the time, no one doubted the importance of the charges against the king. Today, most Americans, including professional historians," she continues, "would be hard put to identify exactly what prompted many of the accusations Jefferson hurled against the king, which is not surprising since even some well-informed persons of the 18th century were perplexed. One critic of the Declaration, Philip York, the second Earl of Hardwicke, reportedly said that he was, quote, utterly at a loss to what facts many parts of the Declaration of Independence referred, and he wished they had been more particularly mentioned so he could better judge of the grievances they contained. Thomas Hutchinson, the last civilian royal governor of Massachusetts, pled complete ignorance as to the specifics of those indictments in the Declaration. But Maier traces the origins of these charges in Jefferson's earlier writings, including his preamble to the Virginia Constitution of 1776. It remains possible, she writes, as several historians have proven, to rummage through colonial history in search of the events that could give substance to Jefferson's charges, some of which are buried in the remote history of colonies other than his own, that Jefferson himself had probably never heard of. Luckily, she adds, Jefferson left important clues to the meaning of the opening charges, including in his 1774 document, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. Jefferson there complained that the king had, quote, permitted our laws to lie neglected in England. For years, he had allowed them to pass no law of any moment unless it was suspended, that law, so that however immediate may be the call for legislation, the law cannot be executed till it has twice crossed the Atlantic, by which time the evil may have spent its whole force. Another way to put this is, law ceases to be law when it ceases to be truly executed. But then we move from the Declaration to the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution. Needless to say, winning independence saved that problem that Jefferson identified, or at least it solved that version of the problem. With sovereignty entrusted to the states, domestic laws would not languish due to transatlantic voyages or the vicissitudes of royal government. Instead, the states found entirely homegrown ways to degrade day-to-day governance. The new states, in constructing their administrations, drew a stark lesson from the colonial experience. Charles Thatch described this in The Creation of the American Presidency. In the struggles leading to 1776, popular assemblies were the bulwark of popular liberties, he writes, and the executive departments were the instrumentalities of British control. And this attitude of mind could not fail profoundly to affect the original American concept of Republican executive power, Thatch writes. Again, popular assemblies for liberty, executive departments for the instrumentalities of illegitimate control. And so by and large, executives in the newly independent states were selected, in every state but New York, the executive was completely subordinated to the legislature. By and large, executives were selected by legislatures, limited to short terms and limited in re-election. And in all but one state, the chief executive was controlled or constrained by an executive council chosen by the legislature. At the national level, of course, the Articles of Confederation created no executive per se, only a weak Congress and the quasi-executive entities that Congress eventually created to administer the national government's limited hamstrung powers. Thatch again recounts the rise of congressional committees as the post-war Confederation's de facto administration. There were some non-congressional offices, to be sure, the purely ministerial office of the Treasurer, the Postmaster General, but the committee, Thatch writes, was the real seedbed for administrative growth. And we all know how well group projects turn out. The problems of these arrangements, and still more problems at both the state and national level, soon became all too evident in the run-up to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Madison cataloged them famously in his 1787 memorandum on the vices of the political system of the United States. Madison begins with the Articles of Confederation's most glaring flaws regarding federal revenues, diplomacy, and interstate squabbling. But eventually, he turns to the problems of domestic governance in the states. First among those problems in the states is the multiplicity of laws, and of course that's a familiar problem today. But just as important, Madison emphasized, was the mutability of the state laws. His description of this problem merits quoting at length. Madison writes, "This evil, the mutability of the state laws, is intimately connected with the multiplicity of laws, yet it deserves a distinct notice as it emphatically denotes a vicious legislation. We daily see laws repealed or superseded before any trial can have been made of their merits, and even before a knowledge of them can have reached the remoter districts within which they were to operate." Madison expands upon this point after the Philadelphia Convention in the Federalist. In Federalist 37's luminous introduction to the new Constitution structure, where Publius explains the importance of, quote, combining the requisite stability and energy in government. He emphasizes that, quote, stability in government is essential to the national character and to the repose and confidence of the minds of the people, which are among the chief blessings of civil society. That's the blessings of stability. But mutability, he adds, is the enemy of stability. Quote, an irregular and mutable legislation. An irregular and mutable legislation is not more an evil in itself than it is odious to the people. And it may be pronounced with assurance that the people of this country will never be satisfied till some remedy be applied to the vicissitudes and uncertainties which characterize the state administrations. That was the cost of mutable administration in the states. Mutable laws, Madison is saying, are repugnant to a truly Republican people. Later in the Federalist, in defending the proposed Senate, Madison returns to the need for stability and the dangers of mutability much more bluntly. He says, with every new election in the states is found to change one half of the representatives. From a change in men proceeds a change of opinions. From a change of opinions, a change of measures. Change over and over and over again. And to trace the mischievous effects of mutable government would fill a volume. Such a country of mutable administration would forfeit its esteem on the world stage, but effects at home would be even worse. Last quote. He writes, it poisons the blessings of liberty itself. It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, if they undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. In short, a regime of mutable, ever-changing laws will demoralize its people in both senses of the word. As Madison writes, such a government constantly changing laws would benefit the moneyed few over all others, presenting a new harvest to those who watch the change can trace its consequences. We call those people lawyers. It would benefit the few, not the many. This is a great echo of Federalist 49 and Madison's writings on the need to venerate our Constitution over time thanks to its stability. Madison here is writing about stability and respect for law in legislation. But then, of course, later in the Federalist, Publius returns to this theme once more with an eye to administration. In Federalist 70, Madison here Hamilton. I always want to apologize in front of Professor Mansfield when I name one of the underlying authors of the Federalist. I know it's all Publius. But in Federalist 70, of course, Publius makes the definitive argument for energy in the executive as a leading character in the definition of good government. It's a famous line, of course. Less famous, though, even among those who readily quote that first line, is the essay's further point that energy is not good for its own sake, but for the sake of the particular functions of Republican government, especially the steady administration of the laws. As Professor Mansfield observes in Taming the Prince, energy is not something good in itself. It is not a virtue. It is not virtue. Yet if energy is not virtue, in the American Constitution, energy leads to virtue. And that is the point of Publius's full argument in the less famous essays that precede and follow Federalist 70 on the importance of steady administration in Republican government. Hamilton, Publius, sees the enormity of what's at stake. Too much upheaval from one presidency to the next would produce a disgraceful and ruinous mutability in the administration of government. Where Madison saw that the public would lose faith in a regime of constant change in the written laws, Hamilton brings readers to an even more pointed conclusion. Even if the Constitution and written laws remain unchanged, the public would lose faith in government if the laws were administered unsteadily. It was, of course, the point of the Declaration's indictments against King George, that enacted laws that went into effect either never or too late were no law at all. And that's the point of Hamilton's astonishing statement in Federalist 68 and 76, that the true test of a good government, the true test of a good government, is its tendency and aptitude to produce a good administration. The Constitution, as Publius saw it, would produce good administration in its construction of the presidency. A unitary office independent from Congress with a 4-year term long enough to empower presidents to administer government with at least some insulation, at least at the beginning of a term, from popular pressures of Congress and the public. And the possibility of re-election would allow a president to be more ambitious in the legislation that he brings to the Congress and more experienced in administering both old and new laws. Even the president's power to veto legislation, Publius argues, is good for the sake of steady administration. Congress left to its own devices would make too many bad laws, repeal and replace them too quickly. The president's veto would prevent bad laws from being made and thus would preserve stability in the laws more generally. How ironic. The veto helps to prevent mutable laws. But steady administration needs not just presidential powers, but also presidential responsibility, even presidential virtue. When the Constitution prescribes a presidential oath to faithfully execute his office, it does so for a reason. And as Publius further explains, the Constitution's primary protection for this need for responsibility and virtue is found not in the blunt tool of impeachment or even in elections, but in other provisions meant to draw out a president's own capacity for good, steady administration and to guard against the vices that would undermine it. With respect to those vices, a president's need to secure the Senate's advice and consent for the heads of departments would deter presidents from surrounding themselves with yes men and toadies, as Hamilton puts it, maybe the best line of the Federalist, obsequious instruments of the president's pleasure. And the prohibition against foreign emoluments, that too is meant to preserve presidential virtue. Publius writes in Federalist 22, one of the weak sides of republics is that they afford too easy an inlet to foreign influence. Ironically, here Publius is trying to make the president more king-like, to the extent that a president's incentives needed to be aligned with the interests of the state rather than with his own personal interests. Again, Federalist 22, a hereditary monarch, though often disposed to sacrifice his subjects to his ambition, has so great a personal interest in government that it's not easy for a foreign power to give him an equivalent of what he would sacrifice. That the entire dignity of a monarch is tied up in the interests of the state, as Hamilton saw it. Hamilton made the same effect at the Philadelphia Convention, according to Madison's notes. I hear it didn't go over very well. In short, for all of its virtues, Republican government lacked this particular protection for public good, hence the need for auxiliary precautions, surrounding a president with worthy administrators and shielding him from unworthy temptations. This was the wisdom, or at least the aspiration of the Electoral College, too. Today we chuckle at Publius's assertion that the Electoral College affords a moral certainty that the office of the president will never fall into the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Even Hamilton gets one wrong. But consider what the Electoral College was intended to bring forth: the election of statesmen whose fame and esteem went far beyond state boundaries. That kind of fame and esteem could come, one hoped, through successful endeavors in statesmanship and military command, perhaps in business, in Washington's case, all three of those things. In other words, the very sorts of endeavors that require a capacity for energy and for steady, successful administration over time. And to win the presidency, the candidates or their advocates would need to plan and execute a prolonged strategy over time across the nation at large. Here, too, we see the connection between the office's necessary virtues and the mode of election. The very process of winning an election would require a kind of steady administration of its own. And this is why Publius begins his argument for executive power with his essay on the Electoral College. By 1787, with the experience of revolution, independence, and the failed Confederation firmly in mind, Publius saw clearly that the American experiment would depend on energetic, steady administration, and to resist, whenever possible, the dangers of mutable administration. In arguing for executive power, Publius connected presidential power to presidential virtue, to public confidence in the government writ large. And that's my point today. A decade earlier, the Declaration had indicted the king for abdicating his responsibilities, an abdication that ultimately destroyed the people's allegiance to him. Now the Constitution would connect the president's powers to the president's virtues for the sake of the public's allegiance, not by commanding the people's admiration, but inspiring it, by winning it. Hence Publius's warning, again, that the true test of a good government is its aptitude and tendency to produce a good administration. Bad administration over generations would end the people's affection for their government. So is our government passing the true test today or in recent decades? I began with an eye to our own era's debates last weekend. And returning to the present time, it's worth noting that many of the greatest problems in government today embody the very problems that the Declaration denounced, the vices that Publius sought to guard against. Our government today centers around the administrative state, and our administrative state is marked, defined even, by all of the worst qualities of mutable administration. Today, the laws that most visibly govern us are the executive orders and regulations that presidents and agencies make and unmake with whiplash-inducing speed. Don't like today's rules or tariffs? Don't worry, they'll be different tomorrow, or in a few years, or after the next election. Far from producing steady administration, now presidential administration produces the very opposite. How better to describe our own era than in Madison's warning in Federalist 62, I quoted it earlier. It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they're promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Laws that are made and unmade so quickly cease to be law at all. This destroys the public's faith in government itself, as seen from the very start in our Declaration of Independence. So here we are, despite Publius's and the founders' best efforts. There's no easy path out of the present crisis. For more than a century, the presidency has learned to be less our president than our unitary legislator-in-chief, a task for which the presidency has neither the right powers nor the right virtues. The result is, to quote Publius once more, one last time, the disgraceful and ruinous mutability in the administration of government that's come to define our age. Simply put, a president cannot be our Congress, and that is another way of saying that a president cannot be our king. Thank you.
So I thought I'd begin by directing my first question to Adam, but I wanted to do so in a way that actually takes advantage of having Harvey here, who's written this, the wonderful book, Taming the Prince, and of course has written on Tocqueville and done the translation of Democracy of America. So my question to Adam basically is, when Tocqueville in Democracy of America starts discussing the presidency, his initial presentation seems to suggest that the presidency is of little matter when it comes to governance in the United States at that time. But then not too long after that, Tocqueville then proceeds to say that in truth, given the right circumstances, the president can be more powerful than any European monarch. So I guess the question is from institutionally whether or not the presidency is inherently imperial. King-like, I suppose.
You're asking me to discuss Tocqueville in front of Harvey Mansfield.
Yeah, you're my colleague, so I can run from you.
I'm aiming for a C. I'm aiming for a C+ here. Tocqueville recognized, if I remember correctly, Tocqueville put it this way: the American president is empowered by laws, but limited by circumstances. And of course, in 200 years since, both of those things have changed. Our laws have changed, made the presidency only more powerful, and not just in giving him powers, but as I said earlier, over the course of a century or more, training the president to be a legislator and desiring more power and more discretion. So at the same time that the laws have given presidents greater power, the circumstances have changed to give the American president immensely more power. The rise of America's place in the world stage, our responsibilities in the world. So I'd begin with that. I'd say two more things. I don't know if this is at all what you're getting at, Gary,
Yeah.
but famously Tocqueville said that in America, administration is dispersed throughout the country. And I guess that's an implicit limit in his time on the powers of the American president. Needless to say, things have changed since then. And administrative power has only been further concentrated in the president. But also Tocqueville noted that with republics, when a republic shifts towards centralized power in one person, sometimes the appearances of the Republican form don't fade away as quickly, and that a person could have enormous power, yet still present himself as a Republican. And that, in a way, is a sort of secret power of the presidency, to wield today enormous power while still sort of presenting the affectation of just an ordinary Republican.
That's Tocqueville's opinion of the president as an executive. Yeah, and when you say that in wielding power you are merely executing someone else's will, you lessen or diminish the appearance of strength. Tocqueville thought that a strong president was one who used his strength to stand up to the people when it was making mistakes or when it needed to be led somewhere. A weak president is one who is merely a leader. You see that? His understanding differs somewhat from ours. And therefore, for him, Andrew Jackson was a weak president whom he despised as a winner not of a military victory, but a small skirmish by which he got his name.
Yeah.
And used it to become the weak leader of a strong popular movement. So I think that's a somewhat different and perhaps better understanding of a strong president than the one we have now.
So staying with the theme of something that Tocqueville writes or doesn't write, actually. Lincoln in 1859 writes that letter where he makes the remark, "All honor to Jefferson for introducing into the merely revolutionary document," I love that, merely revolutionary document, "an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times." Tocqueville, on the other hand, in the Democracy of America, you're hard to find any reference to the Declaration, rights, and the like.
No reference to the Declaration, no reference to the state of nature.
Yeah.
Our rights seem to come from the aristocratic past of the English. Right is something that you use to stand up for something, not something that you use to to make a claim on your own behalf. So that's an original, again.
Do you think Tocqueville was doing this rhetorically purposively, or did he believe? I mean, was there something to be said for making the argument that he did, as opposed to sort of? I mean,
I guess if we were here and we could pin him down, we could get his opinion of the Declaration of Independence, but he never gave it.
No.
And nor did he ever speak of the state of nature. He did have another phrase, the social state, which is something else. So, but
well, I guess I'm trying to get at is there kind of an Aristotelian, maybe it's more Montesquieu than Aristotelian, sort of thinking about the American constitutional system and the Republic? Then, I mean, that's not hidden, but it nevertheless is the approach.
my late wife once said to me that Tocqueville is Aristotle's modern representative.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions I had was, you mentioned liberalism's center being empty, or formal liberalism's center being empty. And of course, there are plenty of people in current debate that find liberalism, at least the formal liberalism, short because it doesn't appeal to our higher aspirations and ambitions. And then you did mention the First Amendment, and I guess what I was going to make the connection is that free speech in the First Amendment kind of opens a door to allowing illiberal theories, philosophy, to enter into debate about liberalism, which makes it even harder to defend liberalism. But I guess my question is, what's striking to me is in the history of the United States is how somehow those illiberal movements, thoughts, visions seem to be gobbled up by Americans. I mean, they don't have the effect that you think they might. Maybe that's no longer the case, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts about why illiberal dogmas don't actually seem to find much ground here. Or do they? Of course, you're at Harvard. I mean,
Yeah. The basic structure of liberalism is, I think, easy to understand and believed in by most people. But there's always this temptation to try to fill it up, to put words in other people's mouths, and to say that my way of speaking is the true way of speaking and the best way. So, which is essentially what our political parties do. And you can say, I believe this, I don't care or know what you believe.
yeah.
But when you vote, you actually do care. You want other people to be ruled by the opinion that you hold or your party holds. So our political parties are a kind of subset or subsection of the formal liberalism, whose basic structure is that everybody can say what he wishes. Mm-hmm. And it's against the idea of ruling other people. It's just that Aristotle's truth, I think, is definition of man is by nature a political animal, remains the case despite our liberalism. So that's what I was saying at the end, that our liberalism needs to be judged by how it comes out. Does it make us live better or not? Even though that's not a liberal question. So our anti-regime, which is an empty center, has to take responsibility for the regime that it actually produces. And that's a kind of illiberal way of judging liberalism as a whole. It's necessary.
Adam?
I would just say, in America, who needs a liberalism when our liberalism is so often a liberal? What I mean by that is America comes to know liberalism, comes to see it first and foremost in the courts and through lawyers. And Tocqueville wrote a lot about lawyers. He said lawyers had the habits of order. They'd be attracted to order and power, presidential power, which having been a lawyer in Washington for 20 years, I know he got that one right. But when our liberalism comes so much through the rules and orders of either the courts or through administration, it tends to lose its liberality because it becomes too theoretical, too absolutist. When I said at the beginning of my remarks, I said I'm here to speak of republicanism, monarchy, and mutability. It's because America's liberalism needs its republicanism to really work, not just an assertion of my rights, which then becomes an assertion of power, but a republicanism that begins not by asserting power, but by reaching out to our fellow citizens in the spirit of a mutual endeavor. It can be liberal, but it begins with a liberalism of self-constraint.
Yeah, the liberalism I was speaking of, the liberalism of Locke and Montesquieu, is 17th century liberalism. Yeah. That's the liberalism with an empty center.
Yeah.
And it's not what people call liberals, or what that liberals and conservatives today fit within the liberalism that I was speaking of mainly, of Locke and Montesquieu, with its basic structure of government distinct from society.
Yeah, and I did, just be clear, I didn't mean the liberalism of Teddy Kennedy. I meant even at America's Best Moments, where it tries to bring forth the spirit of Locke and others for freedom, free speech, free thought, and so on, it sometimes in practice can become a bit too liberal.
Yeah, I like to say that the job of a conservative today is to save liberalism from liberals.
So we should now turn to questions from our audience, but before you do, I can't see a thing with these lights, so I'm going to get under the lights a bit so I can see people. So down here, please wait for a microphone up front. And identify yourself, please.
Hi, Ken Masugi. Thank you. Adam, you began with the arguing for the republicanism of the no kings rhetoric. But I wonder whether much of the energy of no kings coming from that faction, as it does, is really a yes queens rhetoric.
Ken, that was good. I will just say briefly, Ken, I don't want to step on your joke, but during the Tea Party, sometimes the bailout, the no bailouts rhetoric felt a bit more like the, no bailouts for them, or where's my bailout? And today the no kings rhetoric seems to be not their kings.
Yeah. So right here.
Thank you both. This was quite illuminating. But I was curious.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Zach Gardner. I am part of the AEI SHA cohort this summer, but I also am a rising senior at Princeton University. I was curious, Professor Mansfield, what you said about the kind of Aristotelian understanding of religion, beckoning us toward the gods and towards virtue, but yet humbling us and reminding us that we are not gods and therefore should not try and try to replicate that on earth, or at least assume that position. And then, Mr. White, you just described this idea of self-constraint in liberalism. And I'm curious if, at least as I understand liberalism, we're constantly trying to externalize control. So in the checks and balances, you have what the government can do, but Madison says that has to be policed by the other branches. It can't just be assumed, because the branches are rapacious. They're going to try to take as much as they can. So in that vein, is self-constraint possible in liberalism if we don't have that, if we've kind of lost that sense of transcendence and that sense of self-limitation, self-dragging down that happens when we lose kind of the beckoning up that you described, Mr. Mansfield?
All right. a big difference between Aristotle and liberalism is that Aristotle seems to think that religion is a necessary part of human society, though maybe irrational. He treats it as if it were a custom, a thing to believe that may not be reasonable, but which would be defended by reasonable people. And the good function that it has, as you mentioned, is that it holds us to the status of in-between creatures. We are in between beasts and gods. Smarter than beasts and dumber than gods. Something like that. And the question is whether the distinction between church and state can fill the function of religion as in our regime, in our non-regime regime that was filled by religion in Aristotle's regime. And so to answer that, you could look at what Aristotle thought would come from religion. Maybe that's religion at its best. So does religion actually make us better citizens or not? That would be an Aristotelian question to address a liberal practice. And there are studies say that religion makes us better citizens. Of course, these studies are based on surveys which are questions put to raise opinions from ordinary citizens who may not be the wisest and who may not think the best thoughts. But still, that would be the way to begin, at least, to answer your question.
Let the record show we actually introduced political science here. So let me turn over here, please.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, Professor Mansfield. I'm Eleftheria Papadaki from Harvard, and I've been thinking about what you said in your comments about the critical liberalism, the fact that it's fatal flaw, one might say it's a fatal flaw of democracy, that it's open to its criticism so much that it could be open to its own demise. And it reminded me of Aristotle's critique of how regimes fail. Democracy fails because of too much liberty, which it's too accommodating, one might say. So is there a difference between the critique of liberalism, that is too open, it allows for, well, even kings, or is it the same as the critique of democracy itself? And the second part is, to your second part of the comments, where you were talking about the thin version of liberalism, where it has no vision, it has no room for the good life. And that may be true, but at the same time, a way to get out of this situation where both the US and Europe has come to having these opposing visions of the good life, one might say, is to just think that, well, liberalism allows for that and allows for a pluralist situation where you have utility and you have the good life as one might define it, but then that's not all. We also have Tocqueville's inspiration that it was brought up before, that maybe we need to participate more, because that was his point, the town hall, the jury system, that was one of his greatest admirations of the American democracy of the time. So maybe that's what we're lacking, a more thorough and more deep sense of citizenship. How do you feel about that? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I think you can have, we have our attempt to have a liberal democracy. You can have liberalism without democracy. That you get in the originals, in Locke and Montesquieu, who at least for their time didn't think they had democracy and didn't seem to want it. And you can have democracy without liberalism, which is say, Athenian democracy. So we try to combine it. And we use liberalism to say, give rules to our democracy. You must respect the difference between government and society. And we use democracy to give popularity to our liberalism. You can have a democratic society that values the notion of ambition, which is mainly a virtue of the few, in its democratic aspects. So for most people, ambition is the ambition to get ahead or to make a success for yourself, to earn your living. That's democratic ambition, a kind of satisfied ambition. And it helps bring to liberalism the effort and energy of democracy.
I'll just add a comment. I think one of the best things to be done after you've thoroughly read Democracy of America is, of course, read Tocqueville's Ancien Regime to capture some of the key distinctions that Tocqueville makes in the first book, and then the analysis of why liberalism fails in the second. So, please.
Hello, my name is Luca. I'm a student of political science, and my question is for Professor Mansfield. You described modern liberal political science as being characterized by the distinction between government and society, and you ascribed the cause of this separation to the Machiavellian revolt against Aristotelian political science. I wonder what you think of a parallel, perhaps antecedent cause of this separation, which is Christianity and its distinction between political and ecclesiastical authority. Because Christian politics seems to share a kinship with antiquity in that it's oriented beyond mere neutrality, but it seems also distinctly modern in that the laws need not or are not divine. Is the true revolutionary Machiavelli, or is it Jesus? Thank you.
That's a wise question, I would say. You correctly described Christianity. It does not have its own law, unlike the Jews, unlike the Muslims, who do have a law. So that leaves a Christian country free or freer to make its politics than countries of those other two universal religions. But what Christianity did and what Machiavelli did not do was to turn our attention most of all to the other world. So Machiavelli took the sort of Christian distinction and applied it to this world. This world, for Machiavelli, becomes the world. You can see that in his writings. In his two main works, the Prince and the Discourses on Livy, he never uses the word or the phrase "this world." It's always the world. And he says that his knowledge is knowledge of worldly things. So that's one of the main ways, of the first step that he took in defeating Aristotle's political science, is that Aristotle had a notion of virtue that was not common or universal. So it didn't require the other world, but it pointed to the other world. And as I said about Aristotle and religion, he thought it well to have some notion of divinity in your thinking. So, so he thought, Machiavelli thought, that Aristotle was the true origin, Plato and Aristotle were the true origins of Christianity. What they said about the good was what Christianity said about God. What most people think is good, they will want to find in a being who will bring that good to them. So you just change good to God. Therefore, the true opponent of Machiavelli was not so much Christianity as Plato and Aristotle. And that meant that they did he did his best to take Christianity and turn it around, use its strictures and principles to promote the cause of this world. So, for example, the notion of executive that I mentioned earlier. The priest, when he takes your confession, doesn't say, I am ruling you, and this is what you must do and think. He's saying, I'm the executive of God. He speaks to me, and I'm nothing, I just pass it on to you. In general, that's the church. Same thing with the prince in Machiavelli's picture of worldly government.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I just want to say, Adam, you've gotten off very easily. But please join me in thanking our panelists. We're going to take a short break and switch out our panel, so please don't run off.
Great fun. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats so we can stay on schedule. Please take your seats. Thank you. I'm Joel Elisea. I'm a non-resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute and a law professor at Catholic University. Welcome to panel 2 of today's conference, marking the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. This panel, A Nation of Laws, brings together political theorists and historians to talk about the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, our nation of laws. I'm going to introduce all 3 panelists at the beginning with short introductions, and then they'll each come up here to deliver their remarks for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll have an informal conversation that I'll moderate, and then I'll turn it over to you all for question and answer at the end. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to come up and speak. Jack Rakove is the William Robertson Coe Professor of History and American Studies and Professor of Political Science and, by courtesy, Law at Stanford, where he has taught since 1980. His principal areas of research include the origins of the American Revolution and Constitution, the political practice and theory of James Madison, and the role of historical knowledge in constitutional litigation. He is the author of 6 books, including Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History, and Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America, which was a finalist for the George Washington Prize. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and a past president of the Society for the History of the Early American Republic. Akil Reed Amar is Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law in both Yale College and Yale Law School. After graduating from Yale College summa cum laude in 1980 and from Yale Law School in 1984, and clerking for Judge, later Justice, Stephen Breyer, Amar joined the Yale faculty in 1985 at the age of 26. He is Yale's only living professor to have won the university's unofficial Triple Crown, the Sterling Chair for Scholarship, the Devane Medal for Teaching, and the Lamar Award for Alumni Service. He is the author of more than 100 law review articles and several award-winning books, most notably the Bill of Rights, America's Constitutional Biography, America's Unwritten Constitution, and the Constitution Today. Colleen Sheehan is a professor of politics in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. She also holds the David and Patricia Caldwell Visiting Scholar Chair at the Heritage Foundation. She has served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and on the Pennsylvania State Board of Education. She's the recipient of numerous prizes and fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and the Martin Manley Teacher of the Year Award at Villanova University, where she taught for over 30 years before joining the faculty at ASU. Sheehan is the author of the books James Madison, The Spirit of Republican Self-Government, and The Mind of James Madison, The Legacy of Classical Republicanism, and she has published in such places as the American Political Science Review and the Review of Politics. So we'll start with Professor Rakove.
Great, thanks very much. It's wonderful to be here, wonderful to have this introduction. I have been involved with AEI in the past on other bicentennial ventures, going back to the 1980s. So I'm going to use the 15 or so minutes I have in this opening session to describe 5 aspects of the process of what I call in the published paper for this series, the invention of American constitutionalism. And my basic concern is to give you a historically grounded overview, really written from the perspective of, first and foremost, I'm primarily a historian of decisions and events. In many ways, I'm a very old-fashioned historian. The fact that I studied the Constitution, almost by definition, makes me an old-fashioned historian. So I want to give you a historian's overview about how to think about the entire process of constitutional formation that took place in the quarter century that separated the Stamp Act crisis of the mid-1760s from the ratification debates and the proposing of the initial amendments to the Constitution in the late 1780s. It's really a wonderful quarter century to be immersed in intellectually. New problems arise about what happened there, not only because it's of inherent interest historically, but because our current constitutional system is in a state of collapse, if not failure, and questions arising from our current crisis give me new issues to think about on an almost daily basis. There are 5 main points I want to make in my capacity as a working historian. The first, I suppose I could say this is a lesson, but that's not really the spirit in which I give it. The first main point is to say that when we think about this entire process during this quarter century, I think we need to recognize the fundamental fact that it was inherently experimental in nature. It may involve a lot of deep reading in the sources, including Locke and Montesquieu, and perhaps even going back to Aristotle. Each of these guys have backers in the audience, and I'm rather attached to Locke and Montesquieu myself. But I think my main approach is to understand that mostly I'm interested in studying a course of events and decisions, and the individuals who actively participated in this process and the roles that they played. So to specify this point a little bit more, I would say, in addition, we have a quarter century. There are 3 main episodes. There's one in the mid-1760s, really from 1765, I'd say, to 1767, the debates over the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties, where the Americans work out a number of their, I think fairly consistently, the underlying foundation of their objections to claims of parliamentary power over the colonies. There's the second critical episode in the mid-1770s, really 1774 to 1776, which I routinely call the crisis of independence, which involves both the decision to declare independence and why it was taken, but also one of the byproducts of that decision, the need to restore legal government in each of the American colonies becoming states or commonwealths with the advent of independence. So really, it's an exciting period to study. It remains even more so with the semi-quincentennial looming before us, and to really understand what were the nature of the decisions that were taken at particular moments, and why did they take those decisions at that point. So we have the second big episode they call the crisis of independence. Then, of course, there are the great constitutional debates of the late 1780s. Which begin essentially, I think, in the road that gets you from the Annapolis Convention of September 1786 to the Philadelphia Convention, which meets in May 1787, and then down, of course, through the 4 months of debates at Philadelphia, and then into essentially the more or less 11 months or so that separate the proposing of the Constitution from its ratification by 11 states by late July 1788, and then, of course, the ensuing debates over the Bill of Rights. The nice thing about this, I think, in part, is to think about its episodic nature. Meaning there were 3 periods of very compressed debate and then a lot of reflection on it, and then 2 occasions, first in the mid-1770s, to reflect on how far had the colonists moved from where they were in the mid-1760s, and then, of course, in 1787, 88, 89, when there's a whole body of rich experience conducted at both the state and national level of government, which produces a lot of fresh political thinking among American leaders. So that's main point number 1. My second main point, which I think in some ways picks up from our prior panel, is to point out kind of underlying contrast which emerges in the underlying character of American constitutionalism in the course of this debate. The dominant prior concern of Anglo-American constitutionalism, going back to its 17th century origins and its 18th century evolution, prior to the revolutionary crisis, had been to impose limits on arbitrary executive power. That's the essential constitutional enterprise. What kinds of mechanisms of governance can one create within the Anglo-American tradition, relying on representative assemblies, to force executive power to rule with the consent of the people's elected representatives? Of course, how we define the people varies in significant degrees, both between, certainly both in England, but also the difference between England and its American colonies in many respects is quite striking. The suffrage in the American colonies, though somewhat narrow by perspectives, was, I think, by early modern standards, pretty broad. But the critical point I want to develop here is that what happens in the mid-1770s with what I've called the crisis of independence involves recognizing that the initial concern in revolutionary constitution making, especially at the state level, was to think about how does one go about, in a sense, reconstituting and empowering legislative power to be removed from the kinds of arbitrary restraints that the Stuart monarchy and its Georgian descendants could still wield. And one of the main points to recall here, and it came up in the first panel, is that the power to veto legislation or the power to suspend legislation
which is, by the way, a timely issue at this moment in American history, were powers, though they'd effectively evaporated or disappeared in English and or British practice, were still relevant to governance in colonial America. So the initial impulse of revolutionary era constitutionalism was to empower the legislatures to act more broadly, in many ways to turn executive power into merely executive power, the authority to carry out the will and the wishes of a higher source of political authority. But then, by definition, once you reach a condition of legislative supremacy, the main concern of constitutionalism becomes how then does one start to think about how you would now regulate and check legislative power. So that's the second big point, to think about an underlying transition in the basic substance of constitutional thinking. The third major point, and I think the one that's perhaps the most important of all here, is to think about the invention of the written constitution. If my working title for this session, or for my part of this all, is the invention of American constitutionalism, the key departure took place during the crisis of independence. Why? Because royal government or proprietary government had collapsed in every colony, with the two exceptions of Connecticut and Rhode Island, the two corporate colonies up in New England, which actually had no royal officials at all. So they were in effect completely autonomous without any royal oversight, except of the most general kind. Every place else, legal government had effectively collapsed in 1774 and 1775. Why? Because none of the governors could allow the legislative assemblies of the colonies to continue meeting, because they would necessarily support all the resistance efforts to the coercive acts which Parliament had passed in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. So once the crisis breaks with the arrival first of the Boston Port Act and then the Massachusetts Government Act and two other coercive acts, legal government collapses, not quite at the same pace in every colony and every province, but it basically collapses in most of colonial America. Sometimes you have these kind of curious situations where the assemblies are still meeting, but provincial conventions are created, which are effectively surrogate legislatures, which are wielding the real power. The key thing is there is the desire to restore legal government in the American colonies. And the only way you can do that, in part because you have to replace the whole executive branch, there's no way you can't simply reinstitute governments in old form, because you have to reconstitute the executive branch on new, lowercase r, Republican grounds. As a kind of inadvertent consequence of the revolution, you have to start writing constitutions. And the idea of having a written constitution as an essential instrument of government, a document written at a fixed moment in historical time by an identifiable body of historical actors whose names you all know and whose thoughts we can sometimes reconstruct, becomes one of the defining aspects of American constitutional thinking. But this leaves open the question, what is the nature of a written constitution? What is its authority? And concurrent with that question comes actually a closely related one. In I think 8 of the states that were writing new constitutions, in 8 of the states, the bills of rights were part of the process of constitutional formation. But to have a Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights, did that have the same concept? Did that have the same force and authority that we would now associate? Were bills of rights what we might call black letter law that were legally binding, or were they rather statements of principle, something one ought to do in the course of restoring constitutional authority, in the sense to declare the purposes, much as a preamble would do, for the Constitution, or were they meant to be legally binding commands? So the very nature, just as one is uncertain about as a kind of codicil or whatever, just as one is uncertain about what is the nature of a written constitution per se, is it supreme fundamental law, or is it just some kind of super statute that's made necessary because the circumstances warranted? A companion question is, what is the nature of a Bill of Rights? Is it a legally binding text? Does it issue commands to the institutions of government, or does it specify some set of principles, standards or norms by which one ought to behave, but not necessarily legally forceful in the full and complete sense of the term? And one antecedent of this is, as people started retrospectively thinking about this process, the question arises, it's got a technical question because the new constitutions were drafted by provincial conventions, which were also acting legislatively. They were surrogate legislatures, so one of their initial legislative acts was involved writing constitutions. Did that mean that those constitutions were themselves only legislative in nature? And by a well-known statement, and I always say in an audience like this, I don't really need to translate it because everybody will get its meanings immediately, but quos leges posteriores priores contrarias abrogant. Just in case we're not all Latin speakers. I had 3 years of high school Latin back at Evanston, and back during the Kennedy years. Later laws contradicting earlier laws abrogate them. So if a constitution is written by a legislature, since one legislature cannot bind its successors, and since the Articles of Confederation, the national constitution, was ratified by the state legislatures, did that mean that the authority of those constitutions was only legislative in nature, and therefore not fully constitutional in the robust fundamental law sense of the term that Americans now customarily use to describe this? That's my third point. The fourth point then comes out of the third. If we want to think about a constitution in these more advanced terms, primarily because now we want to think about it both as a source of empowering legislatures, but also of creating effective checks and balances on the abuse of power, including the reference, the Madisonian move, references to the multiplicity, mutability, potential injustice of state legislation. How do we go about distinguishing a constitution as a form of higher law from its lesser, I won't say lesser variants, but from ordinary legislation and similar kinds of legal decisions? So this is a great story of, it actually works out the experimental model I referred to at the very beginning. The basic answer to this question was worked out in Massachusetts, which Massachusetts was unique because it's the initial site of the Revolutionary War. 1775, the Continental Congress says in Massachusetts, to restore legal government, what you can do is you can reinstate the Second Royal Charter from 1691, 1692. We'll have the council act as the executive. You can't let Thomas Gage, who would replace Thomas Hutchinson, continue to act as governor. So we're going to recreate a new executive in the form of the council as a whole will become an executive body. Massachusetts goes through several cycles. Starting in 1776, when the first effort to write a new constitution to replace their old royal charter takes place, some of the towns, led particularly by Concord, Massachusetts, start saying, you can't do this. If a legislature writes a constitution, it can also violate it. So that if, in fact, we want to distinguish the Constitution from other law, we need to have a different procedure. The Massachusetts General Court, which is the official name of the Massachusetts legislature, says more or less nish. We don't accept that proposition. And they go ahead and they send out another constitution in 1778. It's rejected, and these objections are again confirmed. So finally what Massachusetts does is it hits on the dominant American idea. Is to have a written constitution, we have to have a special convention formed which will have one sole function, one sole duty, to write a constitution. But also to make it supreme fundamental law, it needs to be ratified, and also, let's say more directly, an expression of the sovereignty of the people themselves. It needs to be ratified, approved, through some mechanism of popular consent. So we're going to send it out to the towns. And of course, Massachusetts always had an infrastructure in place in the form of the town meetings. So the final version of Massachusetts Constitution, written largely but not quite completely by John Adams, went out to the town meetings. The town meetings sent in their so-called their returns, which were brilliantly collected in the work edited by one of my late professors and his wife, Oscar Handlin, Mary Handlin. A wonderful book called The Popular Sources of Political Authority came out in 1965. The problem was when the Massachusetts Convention sent the Constitution out to the towns, they didn't provide a simple checkoff box to say yes or no. So the town returns are a fascinating set of primary sources that are wonderful to read through because of their richness. They are a deeply democratic document, but they don't really, it's not really clear what the final result is. I mean, there was no algorithm available at the time to say, in what form can we confidently say the Constitution was approved? In the end, the convention kind of throws up its hands and says, well, it looks like it was approved. It was ratified. So you don't get a fully clean or transparently decisive result, but it looks to be pretty, in the end, it looks to have confirmed that the process worked, but it wasn't quite finely tuned. And that, in turn, I think had a major impact for the constitutional deliberations of 1787, 1788. Now, when we think about this, and I'm sure when Akil teaches it, when we think about the ratification process, I think the conventional wisdom is, in addition to getting the Constitution ratified, the big deal in the process was to get the Bill of Rights added to it. And of course, the Bill of Rights dominates modern constitutional in many respects, modern constitutional jurisprudence. I'm pretty sure when you teach common law, I think this is true, Akil, usually there are 2 volumes. One's devoted to issues of structure and governance, the other's devoted to really, to the application of the Bill of Rights across all its amendments. I think, speaking as a historian, not as a common lawyer, but as a historian, I think that judgment is misplaced. I think the critical aspect of the Bill of Rights, in terms of the working politics, in terms of reaching, as I said earlier, I am a historian of decisions, in terms of reaching a clear and unequivocal decision, was rather a different proposition. And that proposition was, and the political concern was, we don't want to have a second convention. Nobody knew what the agenda of the convention was going to be before May 1787. And nobody in the American public really had any sense of what was going on in Philadelphia until September 19th, 1787, when the Constitution was first published. And coincidentally, my elder grandson's birthday, which is a matter of some pride in the Rako family. So the idea, the critical proposition here is you want to avoid a second convention, and you also want to avoid a situation in which, let's say, the state ratification conventions will meet. Again, following the Massachusetts example, the Constitution will not be submitted to the state legislatures. It's going to be submitted to state ratification conventions. It's kind of a legal fiction, but it works, which will provide a more direct expression of popular sovereignty than legislative approval. But the political risk you want to avoid is the idea that the constitutional deliberations might not reach a clear and decisive conclusion. So what you want to do, and the strategy the Federalists work out, is essentially to say that, particularly once they get to Massachusetts, the first state where the Constitution is really being, narrowly fought, and where it takes a little bit of oomph to make sure it's going to get ratified, the state ratification conventions will be allowed to propose amendments for further discussion. But they can't make their approval consistent on the prior adoption of those amendments. In other words, you have to ratify the Constitution first in its original pristine form, and we'll discuss amendments at T sub 2, at least at some later time, and decide whether or not those amendments are necessary. And secondly, you don't want to have a second constitutional convention, because if you have one, the delegations are going to arrive with, or it's quite possible that if you do have one, the delegations will arrive with instructions as to what they can accept and what they have to reject. That had not been the case in the original Constitution. The only delegation that had an instruction was John Dickinson, representing Delaware, had the Delaware Assembly give him an instruction to say you can't give up the equal vote in the Senate. Dickinson said, Dickinson raises this point, and George Reed raised it. Convention says no. So the key thing here is you have to have a clear and unequivocal decision. You have to avoid a second convention. You can't have contingent amendments. And the key to all this, and this is the point where Akil and I knowingly disagree, the key agent of this is James Madison, who I sometimes describe as, like Colleen Sheehan does, as my alter ego, at least in intellectual terms. But we can save that discussion for a later point.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be with you all and with such a distinguished panel. The Title of my remarks today is The Revolution and the Constitution, 5 Grand Narratives. Essentially, the American Revolution pulled together and intertwined 4 strong strands: republicanism, constitutionalism, independence, and union. In 1776, 13 mainland colonies jointly declared their independence from Britain. This strand of independence, autonomy from Britain and the British Empire, tightly intertwined with the strands of republicanism, essentially government rooted in popular consent, and constitutionalism, which for most Americans quickly came to revolve around written legal instruments superseding ordinary statutes and case law. Independence would enable the free, non-enslaved people of each colony to govern themselves by and large. The written state constitutions that emerged in 1776 to 1787 were the sweetest fruits, the crown jewels of independence. But independence, republicanism, and constitutionalism could not be won without union, the 4th major strand of the American Revolution. Greater Britain, including its Irish dependencies, boasted a combined population roughly 6 times the size of white America. And a phrase that Benjamin Franklin coined in the 1750s and that reawakened in the 1760s and 1770s, American colonists had to join or die. Join they did, and win they did, but just barely over the course of a long and brutal war. In the Declaration itself, former colonies declared themselves, quote, free and independent states. States with an S, states independent even of each other, save as each chose to work with the others. True, the Articles of Confederation that emerged in the late 1770s and early 1780s proclaimed America to be a perpetual union. But it was avowedly a union of emphatically sovereign states, a mere league, a multilateral treaty, a classic confederation. Essentially, the U.S. circa 1783 was a forerunner of modern-day entities such as the EU and NATO. Each state had a sovereign right to leave, to Brexit, so to speak, in order to preserve its vital sovereign interests going forward, or in response to the failure of other sovereign member states to inviolably, that's the quote, abide by the multilateral treaty. By the mid-1780s, George Washington and his supporters understood the Articles of Confederation were a flop. States didn't pay their dues, and there was no money to repay veterans and other creditors for the last war, much less finance the next war crisis, whatever it might be, just over the horizon. Americans risked losing everything if Britain or France ever tried to reconquer lost ground. Solving the truly existential problems of the Articles, imbecility, would require a slew of changes. In turn, several of these changes created their own problems, which then entailed still more changes. Drafting the Constitution was thus like solving a giant Sudoku puzzle. Start with the war finance imperative, which meant that Congress needed to tax citizens individually rather than relying on state dues. But if individuals were to be taxed, individuals needed to be authentically represented in a new House of Representatives. No taxation without representation, after all. So the old unicameral Congress under the Confederation had to transmogrify into a real bicameral legislature, just like a typical state legislature. As a true legislature, unlike the essentially executive and diplomatic Congress under the Articles, the new Congress could be openly vested with power to legislate over Western lands and over interstate and foreign trade and intercourse. In turn, this stronger continental legislature would need to be counterbalanced by a stronger continental executive and a stronger continental judiciary, mirroring the best state governments under the best state constitutions. The big losers in this schema would be small-minded state legislators who would wield less clout in a new continental regime. So Washington and company needed to bypass state governments by securing a Republican mandate directly from the American people themselves via a series of special elections of unprecedented sweep. More on this in a moment. This, in turn, induced Philadelphia draftsmen to lace their proposal with Democratic sweeteners. a regular census to limit malapportionment, salaries for state lawmakers, for lawmakers so that men without vast fortunes could serve in government, repudiation of property qualifications for House members, senators, and presidents, and more. The biggest fact, the key Republican fact about the Constitution circa 1787 has lain in plain sight all along. The Constitution was put to a vote. That's the obvious meaning of the subject, object, and verbs of the document's dramatic opening sentence. We, the people of the United States, ... do ordain and establish this Constitution. And what a vote it was. The breadth and depth of inclusion were stunning, unprecedented, and in hindsight, world-changing. The launching of the U.S. Constitution in 1787-88 was nothing less than the hinge of human history, the year that changed everything, the Big Bang that birthed a modern world in which democracy now prevails over much of the planet. In 1787-88, ordinary folk across a vast continent weighed in on the proposed Constitution with both voices and votes. In 8 of the 13 states, the usual property qualifications were lowered or eliminated for this special Jubilee year vote. Nowhere were they raised. In New York, all adult female citizens could vote. No race tests, religious tests, literacy tests, or property qualifications. These were not the ordinary rules for ordinary New York elections. But all America understood the need for a special democratic mandate for the bold plan proposed by Washington and Company. Never before in world history had so many played so direct a role in deciding their collective fate. The document's ambition was stunningly continental. Republicanism not just state by state, but along the entire expanse of the United States as a whole. Once again, we need only read the preamble with care. The central aim of Washington and Company in 1787-88 was to create a more perfect union. That is, an indivisible union, on the model of the indivisible union of Scotland and England in 1707, in order to provide for the common defense, which would in turn secure the blessings of liberty. Indivisibility was the keystone of the Great New Arch. Never in the entire ratification year did any leading Federalist suggest that any given state could unilaterally Brexit post-ordainment. After all, if any state were to opt out unilaterally after the Constitution launched, that state could thereafter presumably choose to ally with any other nation as that newly independent American state saw fit. European monarchs might then use that seceding state as a launching pad for military invasions on bordering states. If so, America would no longer be a kind of island nation akin to post-1707 Britain. A large army would be needed to defend the new nation at every conceivable secession point, but large armies would imperil liberty. Navies, by contrast, were far less threatening to domestic liberty, as post-Act of Union Britain itself illustrated. But what about slavery? An issue on which the northern states and the deep southern states did not see eye to eye. The Declaration's evocative phrase, all men are created equal, was not, I insist, the product of Jefferson alone or Virginia alone. Franklin and Adams stood side by side alongside Jefferson in 1776, and under their watchful eyes, their home states of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts soon adopted state constitutions, with sweeping language announcing the creational, natal equality of all humans. In keeping with similar pronouncements in various other northern state constitutions and companion texts, much of the North, prior to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, had already taken steps not merely to free slaves, but to abolish slavery itself, either immediately or gradually. Other northern states would soon follow suit. But whites in the Deep South, especially in stiff-necked South Carolina, did not share this burgeoning abolitionist vision. These men read the Declaration's key language that all men are created equal quite differently. On this crucial issue, even more crucial with the benefit of hindsight, America in 1787 was not an it, but a they. Indeed, America in 1788 was essentially a shotgun wedding of convenience between North and South, who united lest they die soon at the hands of European monarchs who still held sway across much of the globe. To woo the Deep South into a new legally indivisible union in 1787 to 88, the Constitution thus had to accommodate slavery, and did so most disastrously via a 3/5 clause giving Southern states extra seats in both the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. This wasn't the central purpose of the new Constitution, many whose framers and ratifiers dreamed of a day when slavery would end across the nation. Still, the document certainly did serve to bolster an incipient slaveocracy, which would ultimately imperil the very blessings of liberty the document aimed to secure. This, in a nutshell, is the opening act of my preferred grand American narrative. America's Constitution was far more Republican, or Democratic, if you prefer. The words were almost interchangeable contra Madison's Federalist No. 10, far more geography-minded and geostrategic, and far more slavocratic. So Republican, geostrategic, slavocratic, than conventionally understood. In these respects, I've argued that the Constitution was much more Washingtonian, national security, than Madisonian, and that the document's democratic, geostrategic, and slavocratic structure would unsurprisingly lead to the age of Jackson. Alternative narratives. So you just heard one of the five. Bancroft's story. The influential late 19th century historian George Bancroft got part of the story right. The Constitution aimed to solve problems of national defense and cure the imbecilities of a grossly inadequate Articles of Confederation. But even on this point, Bancroft failed to hammer home the key principle of indivisibility. Bancroft also failed to stress the Constitution's astonishing democratic features, features both reflected in and driven by the unprecedented sweep of democratic exclusion in the 1787 ratification process. The process was, from one angle, the very Constitution itself. If we view the Constitution not merely as a written text, but an actual deed, an ordainment, an establishment, a constituting. Nor did Bancroft, a former Jackson Democrat, lay great stress upon the original Constitution's original sin, its pro-slavery structure, anchored in the 3/5 clause. Beard's account. Like Bancroft, the early 20th century scholar Charles Beard scanted slavery's role at the founding. Unlike Bancroft, Beard depicted the Constitution as strongly anti-democratic. If, as Beard claimed, the Constitution was essentially anti-democratic, then why did ordinary Americans vote for it? Why did they unanimously elect and unanimously re-elect its avatar, George Washington, and sweep into power so many leading Federalists in the first set of elections under the new document? How did an essentially aristocratic Constitution, as he claimed it was, so quickly give rise to Jackson's America? On my view, by contrast, Jackson embodied the Constitution's three main themes. Like the document itself, Jackson was pro-democracy, pro-defense, and pro-slavery. Wood's synthesis. This is the the fourth account. So the one that I've offered, Bancroft, Beard, now Wood. A half century after Beard, Gordon Wood, America's greatest living historian, began to put forth his own grand narrative. Wood has rightly emphasized the fundamentally Republican nature of the Revolution, and indeed its radicalism in many respects. He's also rightly stressed the centrality of written state constitutions in the years between 1776 and 1787. But he has failed to underscore the centrality of national defense and the key issue of indivisibility. In line with this early attention to state constitutions, Wood has seen the federal constitution as more focused on solving problems within individual states rather than solving the problems of the Union as a whole. Final narrative, Howard Zinn. If the American Republic fails in our lifetime, it's so painful for me to even say these words. If the American Republic fails in our lifetime, the late 20th century popularizer Howard Zinn and some of his modern followers should bear part of the blame as corruptors of America's youth. Zinn and his many acolytes have sold America's gullible high school students and high school teachers a profoundly misleading story of America, exaggerating many of America's lapses and ignoring much of America's greatness. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, and a special thanks to Yuval. It's very nice to be here with all you, and of course with Jack and Akil. I couldn't help but notice your socks, Akil, the socks that wore us.
We the people, yeah. National Constitution Center.
Well, I've entitled this talk that
He's got a great
honorable-
tie, too.
That's right, that's right. That honorable determination. In Federalist 39, James Madison asked whether the proposed Constitution is truly Republican. It is evident, he says, that no other form of government would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government, unquote. If the new government is not strictly Republican, he argued, its friends will have to abandon it as indefensible. Madison's powerful and definitive claim in the 39th essay of the Federalist is a central statement of principle and purpose of that book. It connects the aims and axioms of the Constitution to those of the Declaration in an unbroken script that tells the story of the American cause. For over a century, the character of the American Republic has been a matter of considerable dispute, though, among scholars of the American founding. Despite Madison's powerful assertion regarding the synergistic relationship between the principles of the Revolution, Declaration of Independence on the one hand, and the Constitution on the other, historians such as Charles Beard and Howard Zinn argue that the Constitution protects the economic self-interest of the wealthy in contrast to the democratic spirit of the Revolution. In a word, the Declaration and the Constitution, they argue, are more like enemies than friends. Gordon Wood also sees the Constitution and Madison's explication of it as a significant ideological departure from the Declaration and the spirit of 1776. And then there are the political theorists, such as Martin Diamond, Tom Pangle, and Patrick Deneen, who claim that the American founding, especially Madisonian theory, was infused with the spirit of modern commercial republicanism and has created a nation whose leading characteristics are acquisitiveness, material acquisitiveness, and moral emptiness. Now, the aspirations and spirit of 76 are those of the Constitution-making era are captured in the central work of two of America's founders, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. For Jefferson, that work, of course, consisted of the Declaration, and for Madison, it was his contributions to envisioning, drafting, and ratifying the Constitution, including the intensive study in preparation for the Philadelphia Convention and his authorship of several significant Federalist essays, as well as his continued work on constitutional republicanism in the early 1790s. Now, of course, I don't mean to say that they're the only authors or father of the Constitution, but I do mean to say that their labors and ideas are woven into the fabric of these documents, which would be very different tapestries without them. Though the fellow Virginians were good friends, Jefferson and Madison did not always see eye to eye on political and philosophical issues. One of the things they disagreed about concerned Jefferson's idea that the earth belongs to the living generation. To this end, Jefferson suggested the calling of constitutional conventions every 19 years or so. He actually worked it out. I think it was 18 years and 8 months or something like that, to provide the people an active voice and also to achieve continual consent in the ordinary operations of government, or as we might say today, to activate popular sovereignty in real time. And the Federalist, and later continued in his notes on government and the party press essays, Madison presented an alternative way to institute the ongoing consent of the governed by making the will of the government dependent on the will of the society and collecting and shaping the will of the society into what he called the, quote, reason of the public, unquote. This is essentially Madison's theory of the politics of public opinion. Now, the politics of public opinion is a layered, dynamic process of filtering out factious demands, collating and considering the multiplicity of interests, and refining the public views. It entails a host of factors, including a large extent of territory, separation of powers, bicameralism, federalism, checks and balances, a free press, and in general, what he called the commerce of ideas that flows between representatives and their constituents, and as he said, throughout the entire body of the people. It also requires a critical mass of citizens and representatives competent to their respective moral and political tasks. What constitutes this critical mass depends to some degree on times and circumstances. In the Federalist, Madison declared that, quote, a coalition of a majority of the whole society, unquote, usually takes place on the basis of justice and the general good. Actually says it in the negative. Will seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good. He also proclaimed America to be pursuing a new and more noble course of republicanism. Note that the course of republicanism is new, not the ends. The discovery of this new Republican course, Madison claimed, is that, quote, and pay attention to what he's saying here, the quiet Madison, who, always wore black, had to always be asked to speak up because people couldn't hear him. You can just feel the excitement in his voice or in his pen when he says what he thinks that he says America has discovered is that, quote, for which philosophy has been searching and humanity been sighing from the most remote ages. This, he said, is the glory of America to have invented and her unrivaled happiness to possess, unquote. Now, in Madison's pre-convention notes called Vices of the Political System of the United States, we see the outline for the new Republican vision. In Vices, he noted that, quote, according to Republican theory, right and power being both vested in the majority are held to be synonymous. This is absolutely key to Madison's thinking, this whole question of right on the one side and power on the other. Generally speaking, the majority is a more powerful group in society, and in Republican government, the majority rules. But republicanism also requires that the majority rules justly, in theory. In practice, of course, this standard often fails to be achieved, which leaves the regime susceptible to legitimate opposition based on its own core principles. What are the core principles of republicanism? According to Madison's conception, we can list the core of republicanism something like this. And this is as succinct as I know how to list his beliefs on this. First, consent of the governed must be the foundation of Republican government. On this point, Madison was adamant and expressed his view vocally and often. To carry genuine authority, the new Constitution must be ratified by the people, not by state legislatures. Why? Because the people are the only earthly source of political authority. In other words, because all human beings are by nature free and equal, no one of them has the right to govern another. Therefore, the only way to establish a government is by consent. Second, in theory at least, this consent must be unanimous. Otherwise, the equal natural right of each human being to govern himself is violated. The unanimous people or will of the whole society is sovereign, according to Madison, and by definition, respectful of the rights of all and in accordance with the law of nature. Consent to the compact is akin to a pledge that every member makes to all the others. This pledge is a guarantee to respect and protect the rights of all. As such, in forming the social compact, a collective, quote, moral being, unquote, has been created. That's Madison's phrase. Sometimes he says moral person, and sometimes he says a moral being. In other words, a social compact is not just a legal document. It is fundamentally also a moral agreement. Third, since unanimity is unrealistic in a diverse society, majority will serves as a plenary substitute for the will of the whole society. Quoting Madison, quote, "The sovereignty of the society as vested in and exercisable by the majority may do anything that could rightfully be done by the unanimous concurrence of the members in becoming parties to the original compact," unquote. That is to say, government is limited by the social compact, by which Madison means not only government officials, but the majority upon whom the will of the government depends. That's it, really, except to understand the meaning and consequence of Madison's Republican theory as it relates to the Constitution and the operations of government, and to see how he himself filled in the blanks on the constitutional and political process side of the equation. For the most part, the process he designed is the politics of public opinion, which is based in the idea that public opinion is the real sovereign in every free government. In other words, the real sovereign in every republic. And that in order for it to exercise sovereignty legitimately, it must be refined and enlarged, guided by reason and grounded in the precepts of justice. Of course, it's not really quite all that simple, for it took intensive periods of study over the course of a few years for Madison to work out his theory of republicanism to his satisfaction. And then too, of course, in political reality, all kinds of things get in the way of the attempt to apply good principles and ideas. As they say in some places like Washington, it's politics, folks. This brings me to the Republican Guarantee Clause, or Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. But because time is short, I'll be very brief about this. I think in the Republican Guarantee Clause, this atrocious allowance, well, maybe allowance isn't the right word, the lack of a prohibition against slavery in a constitution in which you've guaranteed to all the states a Republican form of government. How can that be? How can it be? Either we don't have either republicanism is a totally empty word and has no meaning really at all, or this points to something very important. This is the grimmest compromise in the Constitution. But in this compromise, we see that that's precisely what it is. That it's a compromise with the overarching principles of the Constitution. That this is a Republican form of government, and every member in it is to have this Republican form. By implication, this contradiction in the Constitution, I think, is ultimately subject to the higher standard of right infused in the document's architectonic Republican character. Now, that's not enough said on that, but I hope it's food for thought. Despite the many dissimilarities between Jefferson and Madison in character and outlook, they were best friends. They understood and trusted one another's principles and aspirations for their country. Towards the close of his life, Jefferson wrote Madison about the harmony of their views and purposes. He said, "The friendship which has subsisted between us now half a century, and the harmony of our political principles and pursuits have been sources of constant happiness to me throughout that long period. It has also been a great solace to me to believe that you are engaged in vindicating to posterity the course we have pursued for preserving to them in all their purity the blessings of self-government." In response, and this is very close when Jefferson writes this, where he will be here no longer. In response, Madison also recalled the many years of personal and political accord between them. quote, "You cannot look back to the long period of our private friendship and political harmony with more affecting recollections than I do," unquote. "If they're a source of pleasure to you, what ought they not to be to me?" Now, Monticello and Montpelier are two of the most frequently visited presidential and founders' homes in the country. The relatively short distance between the two residences means that many folks who visit one visit the other as well. Of course, it took longer on horseback in the 18th century for the two Virginians. It was a road, nonetheless, it was a road they traveled frequently and with cheerful anticipation of the time they would spend together. Today, for those of us who travel the ribbon of roadway that connects the homes of Jefferson and Madison, the close bond between them that impelled their travels becomes palpable. Like them, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution seem connected by this unbroken ribbon, with the miles between them hardly worth mentioning, for distance is nothing when it means the gathering of best friends.
Well, thank you all for your wonderful opening remarks. So we're going to have an informal conversation, and then I'll open it up to you all for question and answer in probably around 15 minutes or so. So be thinking of your questions. But Jack, I want to start with you, and I want to start with a question that you really explicitly teed up in your remarks, which is about the legal status of the natural rights in the Bill of Rights. So we have this transformation that occurs that you describe in your contribution to this symposium, this transformation in American constitutionalism that occurs with a written constitution serving as higher positive law, binding all other sources of positive law like ordinary legislation. And the Bill of Rights takes certain natural rights and places them in the Constitution. So one might think that that could lead to an elevation of the legal status of these rights by placing them in this fundamental positive law. But that's a controversial point to say that about these. And so I want to get your thoughts on, as a historical matter, do you think that the founders and Madison specifically saw the placement of natural rights in the Bill of Rights as somehow changing their legal status, as elevating that legal status? And when you conclude, I'm going to ask Akil if he has anything he wants to add to this, because I know, Akil, you've written about the way in which the rights in the Bill of Rights, the conception of them changed from 1791 to 1868. So I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that. But Jack, please.
So the audience should know we have circulated these questions previously, and I've been trying to think about an appropriate answer to Joel's question because, to be honest, I'm a bit puzzled to know exactly where to put rights we want to specify as being specifically natural rights, de rerum natura, in the order of things, in this equation, in this formula. And the way I think about the problem is, and I actually wrote a little book on this subject called Declaring Rights, which is a combination of documents and a lot of critical commentary on my part. When the Americans started advancing their claims against parliamentary jurisdiction, going back to the mid-1760s, they make a variety of arguments about rights. I mean, they hadn't read Dworkin, but they are engaged in rights talk in the broad sense of the term. And so I'm not sure that they cared all that much about distinguishing one form of rights from another. And so then I think what happens is when you get to the transitional moment where constitutions are written, again, one place, one time, by a select group of men through some set of procedures, then you have a fresh way to think about how do you define and clarify and ascertain the specific textual origins of rights. And again, it's a two-step process. I think in 1776, as I try to suggest, the operative verb in the early declarations of rights is ought, not shall. It's a statement of principles rather than a set of legal commands. Then I think when you got to the late 1780s, Madison was given a lot of thought to this and writes, and particularly in his letters to Jefferson, between 1787 and 88, which I reprint in the volume I mentioned, get more specific. I think Madison understands here is a way to solve that problem but he has some significant reservations about it. One is the Ninth Amendment problem. You know, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That you may have an expressio unius exclusio alterius problem. That that if you elevate rights in this way, what happens to the ones you leave out? Now, there is no jurisprudence in the Ninth Amendment, as far as I know. It's almost like the Republican Guarantee Clause in that sense. But it represents an important concept. That, you know, what happens if rights are not fully realized? You might discover you have rights down the road that might work. And then secondly, Madison worries, and I think I've paid more attention to other scholars, Madison worries about textualization. If you want to state a right, which is in many ways a complex concept, how do you reduce that to an adequate textual formula? And I think that's particularly the case in the realm of religion. I mean, of all the religion clauses written in the Revolution period, the religion clause of the First Amendment is the most concise, elegant, and therefore requires the hardest work to elaborate. So I think Madison's worried. You know, if you have to get these things approved, what happens? And this, in some ways, I think, Colleen, this comes back to your question in a kind of backdoor way. You know, what happens if the right you want to affirm remains somewhat controversial? Maybe you don't want to extend freedom of conscience to everyone. You know, maybe, Jews, Catholics, whatever, I'm kind of following Locke, at least with the Catholics in the late 17th century. Maybe Catholics ought to be excluded for some bona fide reason. And the last point I'll make about this is I do think, when I think about natural rights in my own terms, I think, and again, I've written a book on free exercise of religion. To me, the most genuinely natural right is the free exercise of religion. But that follows the kind of fundamentally Protestant conception that it's the idea of the right of free exercise. Well, freedom of conscience and free exercise, dividing those two terms, means this is the one realm where the state can never interfere with our judgment or our belief. Other rights essentially establish standards of behavior that the state has to follow when we enter into some kind of public sphere. The idea of free exercise of religion, whether it's liberty of conscience or a broader conception of free exercise, assumes that judgment is always interior. The state can never reach it. The state can never alter it. You can physically coerce a religious dissenter to get him to consider arguments he or she would not otherwise consider. You can't change his or her belief. So there is a sense which the free exercise of religion is to be a natural right because it depends on properties of mind, which the state has no capacity to reach or affect.
Akil? Building on some of those points, so not all rights are natural rights, and in fact, very few perhaps are. Probably the most important is the right not to be enslaved, and I'm so glad that Colleen, talked about that, and the Bill of Rights didn't do a great job on that. The rest of the Constitution didn't do a great job on that. The category of natural rights. And you could read, since I got these talks at the National Constitution Center, maybe you got yours at the National Constitution, I don't know.
Can't remember where I got it.
The chair of the National Constitution Center, the president is Jeff Rosen, and he has an excellent note in the Law Journal on natural rights at the founding, building on Theophilus Parsons and others. So right not to be enslaved, okay. Freedom of thought, which Jack is talking about, freedom of conscience, freedom of maybe religious expression even, and not that many more other things. You might think natural law, that's different than natural right, majority rule, and other things, but juries don't exist in a state of nature. In the Fifth Amendment, grand juries, Sixth Amendment, criminal trial jury, Seventh Amendment, civil jury, those aren't really natural rights. In nature, is someone issuing a warrant for a search or seizure? Who's doing that in a state of nature? Who's setting bail under the Eighth Amendment in a state of nature? Are there really, I don't want to get Jack started too early on Second Amendment stuff. Are there militias in a state of nature which actually really may come out of a civil society that's organized in a certain way? So lots of the things in the Bill of Rights really aren't natural rights as such. They're public trial? Do you have trials instead? Maybe, but Locke actually talks a little bit about this, and in Jungle Book, actually, the animals do conduct a trial about who owns Mowgli. That's actually the opening chapter of the Jungle Book, in fact. But natural rights are a pretty small subset, actually, of all the things that are in the Bill of Rights, and the core is this right not to be enslaved, to be treated, as a free person. It goes way back to Locke, and we don't actually protect that initially, alas. And thanks to Colleen for mentioning that.
And Colleen, just to pick up with you on this point about the natural law, you emphasize in your remarks the extent to which Madison sees the natural law as both, in some cases, specifying the legitimate ends of government, in other cases, kind of circumscribing what government can do, and that Madison, in your view, sees the Constitution as continuous with the Declaration in recognizing and in some ways embodying these principles of the natural law. But as you also, I think, touched on in your remarks, there are a lot of historians and political theorists in particular right now who don't see the Constitution that way, who see it as having a much thinner kind of moral framework, as being much more proceduralist in nature. But if you're right, if your reading of Madison is right, that
Which
he,
it is.
which of course it is, then how does that change the way we should think about the moral legitimacy of the Constitution?
It's a really good question, Joel. I mean, look, think of it the way an ordinary citizen thinks about these things. Why should I obey the law? Do you obey the law because the law is something that a judge ate for breakfast? It's not very compelling. Or those of you who've read some Plato, when you look at the end of the Crito, and Socrates is frustrated because Crito doesn't quite get it. So the laws stand up in a booming voice and tell you why to obey them. Look, we've been here. We raised you. We nourished you. In other words, it's a quid pro quo. That's it. Is that compelling when you really sit down and think about why should I obey this law? I mean, because or think of the converse. When is it not only my right but my duty to revolt and not obey the law? And so Madison's concerned about these kinds of questions because it's not just a legal agreement. It's really fundamentally an agreement among human beings who not only have the right not to be enslaved, but what is it about humanity that's different? That we have self-motion and that we do that, we can do that deliberately. We have the capacity, even though we don't always exercise it, to govern ourselves. And so, to the extent that we don't live on islands very well, and that to flourish as human beings requires a community society, then we have to figure out in some way how to live with each other and respecting each other's humanity. And that's one of the really exciting things about this idea of republicanism, because I was rereading the Federalist Papers recently because I was teaching a class, and sometimes you find things when you read something many, many times, and you actually sit down and read again, and you see something you haven't seen before. And at the very end of Federalist 43, after Madison's talked about the Republican Guarantee Clause, he talks about what do you do in a situation if all the states don't join. And so they're essentially in a state of nature with each other. He said, the moral relations are still in force. And basically, he tells us why. Because we're human beings. That is the basis of all government for Madison. That's the basis of the social compact. And that seems to me a pretty powerful reason to obey the law.
And Keel, I want to zero in on the disagreement between you and Jack that Jack, I think, mentioned in his remarks. You argue in your discussion of the Gordon Wood, Jack Rakove grand narrative that they tend to put too much of an emphasis on Madison's views and the principles undergirding his views in thinking about the Constitution, and that they underappreciate, as I took you to be saying, the principle of indivisibility among as a rationale for the Constitution. I want to give Jack a chance to respond to that, but before I do, I want to tease out something that a point that I thought you were making here, which is that there might be a tension actually between the Declaration and the Constitution with respect to indivisibility. That perhaps the Declaration, in its concluding paragraph, its operative paragraph, in declaring the states each to be free and independent states, doesn't really emphasize a kind of indivisibility, but that the Constitution does. And that in that sense, there's kind of a discontinuity between the two documents. Am I reading you right in saying that? And if so, would you just say a little bit more about that? And I want to give Jack a chance to respond.
Absolutely, and you can read more about it in this book, America's Constitution, a Biography, my most recent book, The Words That Made Us. Jack and Gordon preeminently write about sovereignty, and under the Articles of Confederation, Article 2, each state is free, independent, and sovereign. And they're building on the language of the Articles of Confederation, free and independent. So it's merely a league, a treaty, a confederation, and the Constitution itself is born in an act of mass secession from the Articles. Jack says, 11 states ratify, well, 2 don't when George Washington is sworn in as president. So they're breaking apart. Each state is free to go its own way. No state can bind any other. Article 7 of the Constitution itself recognizes that. The Constitution, though, once you're in, and you can't leave, and Lincoln is right, and that suffuses, actually, the ratification process. No founder, no leading Federalist ever says otherwise, and it's close in a lot of the states. If there was a money-back guarantee, why the heck didn't they say it in the text, broadcast it everywhere, like, hey, you don't like it, you can leave? They never said it. Instead, they said again and again, in toto and forever, once the Constitution launches, because of the geostrategic project. Say it one or two other ways. Federalists 10, no one pays any attention to at the founding. We've known that since Doug Adair, okay? And this is confirmed by the documentation of the ratification of the Constitution. You can do computer word searches. And it's confirmed by Jack's dear friend, our mutual friend, Larry Kramer. It's confirmed by the empiricism of William Riker. If you have a good argument for why the heck people should vote for this thing that's promising self-government on a continental scale that's never been seen before in human history, would you wait till your 10th op-ed to make it? Of course you wouldn't. So if you read nothing else, the early Federalist Papers, 2 to 8, especially summarized by 8. It's a geostrategic argument. It's a Hamiltonian argument. It's a Washingtonian argument. Now, Madison agrees with it, but he's a political science professor, Moncay, so he has to have his own sort of theory, which he puts forth in 10 and no one pays attention to at the time, or for the next 100 years until Beard. Okay, and Beard has had such an influence on everyone, including Zinn, even my dear friend Gordon and Jack and Colleen. They're all Madison people, but of course, we meet here in Madison, D.C., which is our nation's capital, and when we look up, we see a 555-foot obelisk called the Madison Monument. And Madison, of course, was the unanimously elected presiding officer of the Philadelphia Convention. And when he smiles, actually, people vote yes, and when he frowns, people vote no. None of these things is true. His 5 law clerks actually, in there from 5 different states. No, it's Washington, and he's unanimously elected president and unanimously re-elected president, and people vote for the Constitution because of him. And what I said, and what I tried to say here is, if Madison had been hit by lightning on the way to Philadelphia, you would get the same basic thing, because there's a logic that the Sudoku puzzle, it actually unfolds in a certain way. Jefferson wasn't even there, didn't much like certain portions of it. So it's Washington's Constitution. In every way, people understand that. He's the commander-in-chief who wins the war. Jack didn't have one sentence that he had a great sentence in his paper, but he wasn't able to share with you. Gordon Wood is preeminent, and I so admire him, but when you read Creation of the American Republic, it's almost as if you wouldn't know that there's a war going on. Okay, and Madison's war is in state legislatures because wars require all sorts of laws, and the laws aren't working very well. That's Madison's revolution. Washington's is different. People are dying at Valley Forge because there's no money in the till, which means actually we have to tax individuals. It's a different war that Madison and Hamilton are experiencing, and that's actually connected to indivisibility and all the rest. It's in the Federalist Papers. It's in all the early Federalist Papers. Read Federalist 8. It will take you 3 minutes. Okay? And you look around the world, and Britain is free because it's an island, and Switzerland is free and self-governing because it's got the Great Wall of the Alps, and we want to be free. That's the argument. And it's astonishing, final point, because that's a rather important issue in American constitutional history, whether Lincoln is right or not. But because some of my dear friends in history departments specialize, Jack said he focuses on a 25-year period, and he does. And so secession, nullification, that's another period. And my friend, Eric Foner doesn't go all the way back in the founding. And I'm trying to write a grand narrative unifying, actually, 240 years of constitutional history. You have to actually take a position on indivisibility. Is Lincoln right? Is he wrong? Is it indeterminate? Spoiler alert, he was right.
Jack?
Well, there are a lot of things to say here.
What did you say?
I'll leave aside those aspects of Keel's argument. I actually find it to be kind of silly. I think if you think as a historian, and if you're trained the way I was and Gordon Wood was, your first problem is to ask the question, what is the historical problem that you're trying to solve? That's really the great thing we learned in Bernard Baywin's famous, legendary seminar at Harvard, way back in the day. Washington was America's leading nationalist. There's no question about that. He took that role on at a very early point. I'm not sure he felt it acutely in June 1775 when he headed up to Cambridge, but I think by the end of that year, and certainly by the year of independence, Washington's identification as a nationalist had become his primary form of political affiliation. And I think it's in that capacity, and I think that's how everyone around him, everyone who feels his election is going to be essential to getting, the constitutional republic off to a sound start. I think that's the function he played. If you're interested in constitutional ideas and constitutional theory and the development of institutions, you can't write a book about Washington's constitutionalism. The subject does not really exist. But as Colleen and I know, because we've been in Madison, I started working on Madison back during the Nixon years. When I started grad school in 1969. And I hadn't given much thought to Madison, but once I wrote my first book is The History of the Continental Congress, Madison's role in the Continental Congress, from which he was term limited out of office, the first victim of term limits, along with Patrick Henry in American history. Madison's role in the Continental Congress in the early 1780s, his role in the state legislature, his role, as I didn't fully develop my remarks, but it's in my paper. Q and I have a bit of a debate, who's the real father of the Constitution? I think fatherhood is a silly concept, particularly if you're talking about a collective action problem where people are fulfilling multiple functions, multiple tasks. I think Madison is the grand strategist of constitutional reform. He and Washington collaborate. Unlike Hamilton had no relations with Washington between 1783 and 1787. Madison stops in Mount Vernon pretty regularly. And in effect, they have a common project. It's Madison who gets Washington to go to the Constitutional Convention. Washington didn't want to go. If it's his project, he's nervous about it. And so is Madison. Madison doesn't want Washington to go to the convention until he's sure there's going to be enough of a turnout there to make it worthwhile. Washington is his chief political asset. You don't want to waste your asset if the Philadelphia Convention turns out to be a bust, the way the Annapolis Convention had been. Washington and couples with John Jay and I think Henry Knox, they write letters, sketching out the idea of having a department with 3 governors and so on. Madison does a lot more work, and the documents that Colleen and I spent a lot of time on, particularly the vices of the political system, but his letters to Jefferson, Randolph, and Washington from between mid-March and mid-April 1787. These are the locus classicus of American constitutional thinking as it relates to the Constitution. I mean, I don't disagree at all with Akil's notion of the international and national security dimensions of Washington's presence and Washington's experience and so on. But there's a whole range of constitutional topics out there for which Madison remains the source. And to give one example, it's one of my many back projects, but I have been thinking about doing a book called Vices of the American Political System, some post-Madisonian reflections, but now I think I want to extend the subtitle, say some post-Madisonian reflections on constitutional failure. And I think my new point of departure is that Madison's most creative moment in constitutional thinking, which I think takes place in early 1787, begins as the study of constitutional failure of the Articles of Confederation, and then he derives that. There's one technical point I need to correct Akil on. When you look at Article 2 of the Confederation, it says the states return their sovereignty except for the powers already delegated to Congress. I mean, sovereignty in the American case was divided ab initio, bereshit, from the very beginning. Sovereignty was divided. And working out the implications of what does it mean to have a federal system where sovereignty is divided is a real challenge. It's exactly the thing Madison talks about in Federalist 39, which works out the logic of Federalist 37. It's an application of it. It's actually relevant to presidential elections. It's a good way to point out one of the many things that's wrong with Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in Trump versus U.S., which is just a terrible joke on constitutional history. And the guy who was a history major at Harvard should be embarrassed. Well, should be embarrassed for many reasons, but that would certainly be one of them. I've said enough.
Okay, let's let the audience get involved now. So wait till the microphone comes to you, and please announce yourself briefly. Ask a very brief question because we probably only have time for one or two questions. So we'll start here at the front.
Thank you all for your insight. My name is Sophia Thomason. I'm from Arizona State University, and I was in the AI Summers Honor Program on Education Policy just this last week. My question for you all is, which Federalist paper most urgently speaks to the challenges we are facing today? And it cannot be 8, 10, or 51. Thank you.
For any of you.
Colleen, why don't you?
Well, first of all, that's a pretty good school you're attending. Well, my favorite Federalist paper is Federalist 49, but Jim Caesar already has that on his license plates, Fed 49, so he does. What Federalist paper speaks most? Well, in some ways, I think the most important passage of all the Federalists is the very beginning of 39, about that honorable determination to rest all of our experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. That's what we've forgotten today, I think, in the country, that there are ways that human beings that make sense for us to live, so that we don't need as much government, so that even in this day and age in which 13-year-olds are depressed and contemplating suicide, and all of the things that are happening that make for a society that has more than societies have ever had, but feels less happiness than most have had. I think it's time to recall us to genuine first principles. That has to do with what does it mean to be human? And how do we think that through in our lives together? And that is something we're just not doing very well these days. And politics has limitations. It's not about all of the human things. It should contribute to the human things. And just to put that in very practical terms for a moment, something that Yuval has been working on. Just take the legislature, for example. It's not doing its job of legislating. How many people in the legislature actually want to be legislators. They'd rather abdicate that responsibility to others. And in doing that, I mean, maybe they win re-election and maybe they get to stay there and be somebody, whatever that might mean. But they're totally ignoring public opinion, which is what their job is, to refine and enlarge that opinion. So that when we come together, we have a common cause. We have something that we work hard on to find some kind of agreement, because that's what genuine societies do. Right now, we're not acting like a genuine society, and I think it's partly because we've forgotten that should be directed by the human things and not these things called transhuman.
Jackie Keel, anything you want to add, or shall we move on?
Let's get another. Oh, sorry.
Well,
Okay.
3, first paragraph of Federalist 1, that it's up to Americans to show that self-government can work in the world, and a bad election on our part will be the misfortune of all humankind. 8, because it's all about actually geostrategic unity, because we are at risk of falling apart. And the last paragraph of 55, the first two were Hamilton, where Madison says, Republican government presupposes virtue in the citizenry in a greater measure than any other system. Our system requires more of ordinary people, voting, serving on juries, paying our taxes, being respectful to other citizens. There are other regimes that don't require knowing our Constitution, knowing our history. There are other systems that don't require nearly so much. And we can blame the people in Washington, D.C. in that building, or we can actually look in the mirror. And actually some of our failures are failures of the society itself. That's the last paragraph of Federalist 55, which is a Madisonian paragraph. They're Madison folks. I'm more Hamiltonian and Washingtonian.
Okay, we have time for one more question, I think. Let's see here, right here.
Hi, my name is Prince. I'm a rising senior at Yale. I actually took Professor Marr's con law class in my sophomore year, so great to see you again. I guess sort of my question would be in regards to, so in a lot of constitutional law analysis, at least in my experience, I haven't seen as much sort of emphasis on kind of like analyzing how kind of state constitutions and like state legislators, like legislature, like contributed to kind of like the amendments and the kind of constitution that we see today. And I think that's what made a part of Professor Marr's like book stood out to me. I think he was talking about the Second Amendment and how that kind of was likely largely influenced by like one of the Virginia statutes and around the same time. So I'm curious if you either want to speak to that or just speak to the importance of kind of looking to kind of state constitutions and state legislatures to kind of like more effectively determine like the true kind of meaning of certain amendments and stuff like that.
So anyone very briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. We mentioned the great Gordon Wood and his first book, which wins the Bancroft Prize. It grows out of a dissertation at Harvard under Jackson, his and Pauline Mayer's mentor, Bernard Bailyn, is about the state constitutions. Only at the very end does he actually talk about the federal constitution, as almost an afterthought. And interestingly, he writes other books that begin, the beginning date in the title is 1789. He hasn't really quite written, a definitive book just on the Constitution, start to finish. Jack's Pulitzer Prize-winning book is more about that. So he tells a story, and Jack tells a story. In part, it's failures of the state constitutions. And there's a famous letter that Madison writes to Jefferson saying he thinks that's what's really leading more to Philadelphia, and we need to fix state constitutions from above. We need to replace, in effect, the British monarchy and Board of Trade that stabilized the colonies from above. We need to do some of that. And that's because they're focusing on state constitutions and their pathologies. This is what they do their early work on. And I'm telling a different story. State constitutions are huge. And Jack is saying that it's a really experimental period. And of course, I'm saying there's a different model, a way of thinking about it. The federal constitution is more about fixing the problems of the Articles of Confederation and fixing the problems of the state constitutions. It does have some limits on what states can do. In Article 1, Section 10, no state can have a bill of attainder, ex post facto law, coin money, make something other than gold or silver, legal tender. A Republican form of government is like Article 1, Section 10. But most of the Constitution isn't quite about that. My claim is a different one. If you're going to create a new federal constitution on the model of a state constitution with 3 separate branches of government and a bicameral legislature and judicial review, which states are already doing, and all the rest, you're going to actually study the pathologies of state constitutions to avoid them in your federal constitution. Not to solve the problems of the state constitution, that's not the primary mission, but to create a federal constitution that will avoid some of the pathologies of many of the state constitutions. Too much power in the legislature, not a strong enough independent executive, not a strong enough judiciary, bad amendment provisions. Like how do you make it higher law, without a sensible idea of launching it in a separate way and amending it in a separate way? Some of the stuff that Jack was talking about before. Those are 2 different ways of both understanding how important state constitutions are in the project. And I think we all agree that 1776 is particularly important. It's about the relationship between the Revolution and the Constitution, because in 1776, Tom Paine writes this, John Adams writes this, oh my God, we uniquely, maybe almost in the history of the world, we're among the few peoples in the world that actually get to adopt our own constitutions for our own government. Wow, those were the heady days of 1776.
I'll just make 2 quick points. Gordon, in his book, which Gordon's book is really in many ways the basis. I won't say the basis of my whole career, but certainly the basis of much of it. It took me many years to really master the whole book, but he never writes about the Constitution per se.
Yeah.
His discussion is about the difference between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and how their different frameworks of thought represent very different modes, very different perspectives on political thinking. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 I want to make is that the most Madisonian part of the Constitution is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, because it's the one that goes directly to Madison's argument that the worst sources, the most conspicuous and most dangerous sources of faction, being the great evil, are just simple arithmetic terms, are much more likely to arise at the state level than at the national level.
Agreed.
And so Section 1, there are different readings of Section 1. Now it's the centerpiece of American constitutional jurisprudence. It may have been a kind of simple formula. It undoes, the 18th Dred Scott, right? It solves the citizenship problem, notwithstanding all this Narishkeit that's swirling through the population about birthright citizenship. But in a certain sense, I ended my chapter on rights in my book Original Meanings by saying, this is the most Madisonian part of the Constitution.
Great.
In a certain sense, in one sense that's slightly perverse, but on the other hand, it's essentially true.
One of the things that when I hear us talk about the question of whether there's divisibility or not, I'm reminded of what Lincoln says, that the Union is older than the Constitution and the Declaration.
Right.
And so what is this Union that goes back to 1774 for Lincoln? That's a question I think it's worth thinking about, because, another way to ask the question is, when did we become a people? And that's as important of a question, I think, than the question of state sovereignty.
And on that, if you want to read Federalist number 2, which is Jay talking about how we're a people in certain ways. He says we speak the same language. It's not true. He says we're a band. He says we're kind of related to each other. That's not quite true either. He does say, though, that we fought a war together. But Federalist number 2 has some, and he says geographically it makes sense for us to be a unit, but you might want to look at Federalist 2 and about the ways in which we are a people.
And Madison corrects him in Federalist 14 and says that it's not just about our ancestry, it's because we fought together in a common cause.
Correct. 14 is an important Federalist paper.
Well, you all have a lot of reading to do after this panel. Thank you all for joining us for this conference. Please thank our panelists.